Greetings, this is Rebecca McCarthy for cmst245 at South Seattle Community College. How are you doing? Today I want to talk a little bit about Chapter 3 in Rhetoric Online called Interactivity, Its Nature and Functions in Online Communications. Now, this chapter speaks a lot about how interactivity works with computer-mediated communication and between user-to-user interaction. Now, it seems in some ways that this should be a very easy topic, and interactivity should seem, on the surface, a very common idea that what's the big deal, right? I mean, we interact every day, correct? We say hello to each other, we shake hands, we interact with our computer. So why are the authors spending so many pages talking about how to define interactivity, why it's difficult to define interactivity, and how we can sort it all out? And I was thinking about the best way to explain this. And one of the best ways, I think, to explain this concept has to do specifically with our discussion post question. Now, you'll notice that when I laid out the requirements for our discussion post, that I'm very, very specific about it. First, you have to have your initial discussion post done by Wednesday, and then you are required to post at least 3 separate times each week, and that you have to post at least 2 replies to your classmates, plus also to respond to me if I should leave you a follow-up question. It seems that this is like real micromanaging on your instructor's part, that I am making these really major kind of rules about how you can discuss on the discussion board. And it really comes down with this whole idea of interactivity. Let me tell you what I experienced when I started teaching online and how I ended up developing these rules, and I think that you'll see that this discussion that I'm going to give you about discussion posts has direct repercussions for this particular chapter. When I first started teaching online, I did require still my students to have 3 discussion posts a week, and I required them to have 1 discussion post that answered the questions I asked them, and then to respond to 2 people in the discussion section. And what do you think happened? I'll tell you what happened. It's very interesting. All the discussion posts came on the very last day that the assignment was due. So basically, if the classroom ran from Monday to Sunday, if the unit ran that particular week, I would get almost every single discussion posted on Sunday, and all the responses posted on Sunday as well. And so I was stuck with this problem. First of all, there's a practical problem, right? How am I, as an instructor, going to feasibly be able to reply to all of you, all of your initial posts, and read all of the response posts in a matter of 24 hours when they're all posted at the same time? So there's the practical side of the problem. But on a far more important side of the problem, I realized that there wasn't a discussion going on. As a matter of fact, there was no discussion going on at all. People were posting at each other, right? So people posted the answers and they gave replies, but then they took off, never came back to the discussion post, so there was never any discussion happening. Now, if we were all in a face-to-face situation and I threw out these questions, I could break all my students up into little groups, and I can say, have a conversation, and in a matter of 2 hours in one day, you could sit and you could discuss the major questions I asked and also the answers, and then debate it together in groups, or we could debate it together as a class in a face-to-face situation. But as you can tell, this is actually impossible to do in an online situation. So how am I supposed to create, this is the question I asked myself, an activity in the discussion area where interactivity was actually occurring? So my next step was to revise this assignment. So I had everybody post by Thursday of the week, and I required everybody to have their 2 response posts done by Sunday. What happened was that everybody started posting by the Thursday, but everybody posted their response posts on Sunday. With the change in how I made the assignment, now students who posted on Thursday could at least respond back to me, their instructor, but they weren't really having a conversation with each other because everybody was waiting until Sunday to make their final posts. Generally, I have found that human beings are procrastinators on the best of days and on the worst of days. This doesn't mean that they don't necessarily don't care for the work. I'm sure my students did care for the work, but life gets in the way. So I had to find a way to create this conversation once again. So I reformed the assignment one more time, and I moved the first post up to Wednesday, and then I had the rule in which my students had to post over 3 separate days of the week. And this allowed for interactivity. It took a long time for me to find this formula because I didn't want to be unreasonable as to when the first post should be made. And I didn't want to be unreasonable as to forcing conversations. And yet, as we probably all would agree, if we have these conversations on the discussion board, we are more likely to be able to understand the material we're talking about, and we actually get something out of the experience. We get an interactivity experience out of discussions. And I wanted to bring you on this journey of how I finally came to my discussion post expectations, because I think that more than anything else, it explains very well, or at least it offers a great example of why the authors spend a great deal of time in the beginning of this chapter discussing about how and why scholars have a hard time with this term, interactivity. Now, if you notice if you go to any discussion in general, whether the discussion is happening in our classroom or online, sometimes you'll notice that there are ridiculous responses. For example, let's say I gave this wonderful response on the idea of interactivity in our discussion, and I get really deep into examples. And then somebody comes and says, "Why did you use an apple instead of an orange for your example?" That actually then asks us to question whether or not true interactivity is happening. Because the person who left the comment, they are not necessarily engaging in the material or the content of my post. Rather, they are focusing on this small, rather insignificant idea that my post brought up, the fact I used one fruit instead of another fruit for my example. In discussion posts, another way in which interactivity never works is when somebody just comments on your post, "Hey, that was an awesome post. I totally agree with you." The reason this isn't interactive is simply because we don't know, A, why this person thinks the post was good and what aspects of the post that this person agrees with. Most of the time when we look at somebody's suggestion, we may agree with a lot of what they have to say, but we don't agree with everything. So it becomes an interactivity when we don't bother to actually deal with the content of the original post. And we see that our authors here talk about this a great deal. And they're looking at a type of sentiment analysis. That is, they're looking at so just like I struggled to have to find a good way in which to create interactivity on my discussion posts for my online classes, the authors start to investigate the different ways in which we can create inactivity online, or we can analyze how inactivity is happening online. If you look on page 55 under a useful taxonomy of interactivity, you will see that the authors give us different ways in which we can accomplish this feat. They look at ideas such as user-to-system activity, and what does that entail specifically? User-to-user activity, what does that mean? And user-to-document activity. Under each of these different 3 ways of interactivity, we are actually functioning differently as we interact. So if I am interacting with a system, interactivity will be defined differently than if I'm working to interact with a document online. So it is important to look at the finer aspects of interactivity, I think, because what the internet has done for us and what a lot of this technology has done for this, it has changed how we actually interact with each other and the technology. And more important, it has changed how good interactivity is actually happening, right? So if I am answering your blog post and I just say, "Oh, that's awesome," am I really interacting with you as a user? Have I really bothered to interact with the content that you have left on that discussion post? To end this short podcast on interactivity, I think it's important to note, and of course our authors note this very well, that full interactivity or non-interactivity takes place in many different ways. And you can find a good, by the way, definition for non-interactivity and full interactivity and quasi-interactive or reactive activity on page 54. These are three very important terms that you're going to want to be able to understand. But interactivity happens more than just typing a response, right? So, for example, if you are visiting a YouTube video, right, and you are really inspired that by that particular YouTube video, you may just leave a comment in the comment section. Or rather, you are so inspired that you make a video response to that particular video. So interactivity and full interactivity can happen on a multidimensional level where you're using many different media forms besides just speech and or typing. So when we look for interactivity, we need to see how these different kind of streams of interactivity come together online and interact. How do the comments relate to the video feedback, relate to a cartoon feedback, and so on and so forth. Also, if you look at Facebook, how is sharing an item considered interactivity? If we just share or like something on Facebook and somebody's comment, are we non-interactive? Are we being fully interactive, or are we just being reactive? And what does this mean for the person who originally had the post or the content online? Lots of questions to ask about this term, actually. So I hope you enjoyed this chapter, and I'll see you on the boards. Goodbye.